Can you hear me at the back? Good. So welcome to everybody, and thank you very much for attending in this extremely hot weather, but hopefully the fans are helping a bit. Anyway, my name is Susan Downs, and I work at the John Radcliffe. I'm a consultant ophthalmologist and professor of ophthalmology, and I'm introducing this session today. So one of the main drivers for the establishment of the Kellogg College was to make studying in Oxford open and accessible. Whilst originally this meant providing a college home to part-time graduate students, today accessibility means something much broader. We ask ourselves, who is being included and who is being left behind, and how do we remove barriers both perceived and actual? These aren't questions just for Kellogg College or the University of Oxford, but for us all, for schools, businesses, government, services, for everyone at all levels of society. At this event, where we discuss access for all, the promises and perils of assistive technology, it seems a good time for me to mention our new Oxford Kellogg Vision Centre. This was launched last summer. The centre is one of Kellogg's associated research centres and will serve as a home for knowledge, collaboration, research and advocacy in visual impairment, strengthening Oxford's contribution to the global challenges of sight loss while improving the lived experience for individuals with visual impairment. We are in the process of creating an accessible website which will host an online information hub to act as a central resource for the student body with visual impairment and to inform the wider community. On the website, we will have a signposting section for resources to aid individuals with visual impairment. This will include, for example, links to the support services available, an information hub, and for drop-in events. These opportunities will focus initially on entrance to the University of Oxford, but the aim is to expand this. We will run a programme of educational talks here at Kellogg. You will hear about our autumn events shortly. And we are fundraising to support researchers working in the area of visual impairment, and will publish opportunities for relevant research. So, back to the main theme. Today at College, I'm delighted to introduce this accessibility event. The college has assembled a wonderful panel of experts, advocates, advisors and users of AI assistive technologies, and we are here to explore whether AI can live up to the promise of creating access for all and what perils might lie ahead. I'm delighted to list our panel, and a fuller introduction to our panellists will be given by Ben Tillier. Before I list them, I would also like to acknowledge the hard work of Alison Cook in conceiving and putting this excellent event together. So we have Hector Minto, the CEO of Curb Cut Limited, Dave Williams, the chair of the board of Braillist Foundation, Charlie Turrell, Accessibility Champions Manager and Engagement Lead at the Ministry of Justice. And finally, Ben Tillier, our moderator for the conversation, who is the head of digital accessibility at the University of Oxford. Ben joined us 2 years ago to lead this digital accessibility strategy. He has worked in digital accessibility for more than a decade, including contributing to accessibility guidelines at the W3C, and is a strong advocate for moving beyond compliance towards genuinely human-centred design. I would like to hand over to Ben now. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the last event that is in my calendar for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which was on Thursday last week. I think it was the 15th Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And we're also coming up to the 2-year anniversary since the launch of the European Accessibility Act, which is another big milestone in our calendars as accessibility professionals. But I think a more important, well, no, just as important milestone was last week. May the 19th saw Google's Gemini 3.5 Flash model launch, and there's one every week, and I think that is going to be a key factor in this conversation about the speed at which these technologies are progressing and being released to us as consumers. These agentic AI tools and smart bots have been marketed to everyone in this room as something to help us do things help do things on our behalf, whether that's from reading or writing text, or whether it's consuming multimedia, or all the way to decision-making and complex reasoning as these models are getting better. But this wasn't always the case. AI isn't new. AI has been centred here at the University of Oxford since 1965. A pioneer in the field, Professor Christopher Strachey, founded the programming research group literally across the road at 45 Banbury Road. But the AI that he was producing in the 60s is miles apart from what we're looking at now. There is a quote that Professor Strachey said, that I'm going to read now. He said that much of the practical work done in computing, whether that's in software design or hardware design, is unsound and clumsy because the people who do it, who design these software and hardware, do not have any clear understanding of the fundamental design principles of their work. And I think that's as true today and is the cause of much of the inaccessibility of the digital world as it was back then when he said it in the late 60s. For those who aren't aware of how AI models are put together, one of the final pieces is that they are refined. They are refined over and over again to allow the models to come up with something that looks correct and looks normal. This refinement prevents them from handling nuances that would be necessary to let people with disabilities get correct answers 100% of the time. When this model refinement goes wrong, in extreme cases, we see it on the news. On X, previously known as Twitter, Elon Musk's Grok chatbot began sprouting extremist rhetoric views back in 2025 because of biased input data and damaged guardrails. I truly believe that these systemic flaws result in the exclusion of disabled people in the AI space, primarily because the lived experiences of people with disability are treated as statistical outliers when people are cleaning the training data, and that erasure gets baked straight into AI. And now, to cheer the situation back up, I might just introduce the panel a bit more. So sat on the far left is Dave Williams, the chair of the board of the Perils Foundation. When I first saw writing and mentions of Dave, it's when he was a design ambassador at the RNIB, and he brings 25 years of professional and lived experience to the panel today. Next, to his right is Charlie Turrell. As you heard, the Accessibility Champions Manager at the Ministry of Justice. We've spoken on panels before, and if you want to get involved in the Champions of Accessibility network that Charlie founded based on LinkedIn, please reach out afterwards. And last but not least, Hector, CEO of CurbCut. The company name comes from the curb cut effect, the phenomenon that designing assistive technology or technology in general for people with disabilities will ultimately benefit everyone. He's a veteran of the enterprise accessibility space. I met Hector when he was director for enterprise accessibility at Microsoft, and he's the UK government's disability and access ambassador for the technology sector. I left Hector till last so that I can continue with the second of my two definitions. AI is out of the way, we've got assistive technology, and then I'll yield the floor to you, Hector. AT, to me, assistive technology is a broad and far-reaching term. Any piece of technology that's designed to help people with disabilities perform tasks in this hostile world, whether that's the digital world or physical world, can be classed as assistive technology. Whether that's a standalone device, like a device used to emboss braille onto pieces of paper, whether that's a piece of software on your phone to convert text to speech if you have dyslexia, to help you to comprehend emails, or whether it's a physical device like a hearing aid to support people with hearing loss. These are all assistive tech. But they're not always technology isn't always marketed as such. We're seeing now, Hector, I see you wearing them right now. We have Hector's wearing a pair of Ray-Ban Meta smart glasses.
They're off now.
And the Amazon Echo smart speaker. They are not classed technically as being assistive technology, but they are often referred to as such because of the overwhelming benefits they provide to people with disabilities. And those lines can be blurred even more. All of the phones, laptops, tablets that you have with you today or at your home have assistive technology style settings built into them, whether you have a setting to adjust the font on your laptop or whether you make use of the sound recognition feature baked into iOS that helps you, it alarms you that there's a smoke alarm happening if you are deaf or hard of hearing. These are all like pseudo pieces of assistive tech. Hector, I'm going to pass this to you now. So I get the sense that these new wave, the AI tech companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, as well as the stalwarts of Google and Microsoft have been lured into creating new tech just for technology's sake, just to keep their place in the AI race, whether or not they're stopping to benefit. They're stopping to ask whether users will benefit or whether they even want it. Do you think that they're learning from the curb cut effect of previous eras? And what's your take on this?
Easy run-in for the first question. Short answer is no, absolutely not. No way. Whenever things are rapid in the tech sector, all of the good stuff gets forgotten about. When I joined Microsoft in 2016, I'm just moving past all my prepared notes now, I'm just going to go straight into it. When I joined in 2016, there was a real moment around the ability hacks, which was this idea that we now had cloud-connected computers and we had cognitive services in Azure in the cloud. Yeah, so suddenly people could start accessing new tools in their toolkit and everyone started hacking pizza and beer and tents around disability issues. We would coalesce around disability issues with people with disabilities and start designing around it. And then I would go to kind of other tech companies that weren't Microsoft, and we would be described as kind of, the sensible adults in the room, that we were doing this kind of stuff because nobody else was doing it, whereas even well-known other tech companies were kind of not really at that table at that point. But the motivation was we were trying to educate a wider audience on what could cloud-connected computers do around disability, but then that was going to create the curb cut effect. So, for example, the blurred background that everyone uses now was designed for a deaf use case. It was designed for lip reading, yeah? And then the curb cut effect was that everyone went, I can hide my laundry now, right? And that's a wonderful thing. The captions that are commonplace in the Copilot/Otter AI world that we all live in now, where notes are being taken automatically, of course, came from the deaf experience as well. They were not good when we first turned them on. And a lovely little story I always tell people is they were terrible in German. Okay, let's think that through. Why were they terrible in German? Because Germans always say no to the data, as in, you're not having my data. It's absolutely cultural within Germany that you would say to them, turn this feature on because it will allow us to train the model on captioning. And they'd be like, nope, absolutely no way. Whereas we would all, in the English-speaking world, we would all say yes. Hinglish, the term we use for Hindi English, the accented English, was more accurate than German. Yeah? So this goes to the absolute point of the data is going to be the thing that determines whether these things are inclusive or not. But to answer your question, I am deeply concerned at the rate of change now that we are seeing. It's like you say, the new versions all the time. Everybody is digitally transforming around us at the moment. And I don't think there are enough teenagers in the room or adults in the room. And I mean that there's not enough maturity in the companies, and I see it all the time. We would spend forever training people at Microsoft, and this is going to shock you, and it shouldn't shock you because all organizations have to go through this. But what is disability? You think everyone knows how a blind person reads an email. They 100% do not understand how a blind person reads an email. Yeah, that's nonsense. Yeah, but we would assume that you didn't need to train people and stop and slow down enough to explain something like that. So when you show designers and tech companies their products, how they're being used by people with disabilities, and this goes across all organisations, banks, education organisations, the whole kit and caboodle. You do have to slow down enough to spend time on this topic to get people to start doing real work. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but maybe to kind of the follow-up on it is no, they're not doing it. The thing is worryingly fast. Digital transformation at the moment is worryingly fast. There's not enough regulation in place that's going to sort of force people enough to slow down. We have seen this in the child protection stuff that's going on and everything that's happened in social media. And we couldn't possibly regulate social media. Why? I find that absolutely astonishing that we think that's a difficult thing to do. Yeah. But the new companies coming through, the lure of changing the world far outweighs slowing it down enough to include the people who are going to be left behind. We did it one other time, just to give you an example. We did it with Teams. So when the pandemic hit, and I'm sure there'll be people in the audience who remember this moment, but when the pandemic hit, every organisation started using Teams. It had been around 2 or 3 years, but then everyone went, we should probably use this now. Even at Microsoft, I used to joke with my colleagues. I've left now, so I can say what I like. No, I always did. I used to joke with my colleagues that my American colleagues would hold inclusive meetings for me as a Brit at 9 o'clock in the evening, whereas before the pandemic, no one did that. The audio was terrible. I could barely hear what anyone was saying. Then suddenly everyone started to use Teams. But because everyone started to use Teams at pace, all of the flaws in accessibility came out really quickly because of the pace of change and the rate of adoption. So the very long answer to your question is no. And I think the only things that's going to force people to slow down enough is voice, like a little bit of militancy, I would say. Disability is a political issue. If I can't use your system, that's political to me. And then getting the basics in place, slowing down enough to train people on absolute basics about what is disability, what is accessibility, they are different, and what is assistive technology. For the accessibility folks in the world, sorry Charlie, this is a great way to hand it across to Charlie. Way too little attention has been given to assistive technology in the accessibility world in the last 10 years. We have gone with the assumption that if we create accessible infrastructure, websites, documents, the assistive technology is going to look after itself. There is so little awareness out there on assistive technology that to me is what this next, that to me is probably what we're going to focus on using AI for. Sorry, that was a long intro.
Yeah, I love your point about the information that we're feeding it, and the fact that you mentioned obviously with the German and the fact that that information is not going in and therefore we're not getting accurate stuff. And I think again when you're talking about disabled voices, quite a lot of environments and organisations, I mean we could go on all day about recruitment and the fact that sometimes the stop is inaccessible applications and the ways that people are actually being able to get into the business, or the fact that even interviews aren't accessible, so therefore the disabled voices aren't even in the company to then be able to feed the AI and things like that. But the point that you made around guardrails and governance, that is essentially what we need. That is something it's often framed as guardrails around the tool, but we need to think about what we're feeding it as well. So are we feeding it historical information in our company, and is that historical information biased, and has it got the right language, and all of that we need to make sure that the right people are in the room. And so I think from just progressing that AI, it is about making sure that we're inclusive in our space to start with, and the information that we're feeding it is inclusive, and then hopefully that will start to kind of trickle down and we'll see a real impact.
I'd like to hand over to Dave next, and while this conversation was going on, I was reminded of a trip to a council office in London that I was in, where I was walking down a set of stairs, and there was a "Mind Your Head" sign above me in the stairwell, and there was a Braille embossed sticker on the "Mind Your Head" sign, and that's obviously there because someone hadn't quite grasped the foundations that I alluded to earlier on. And I guess my question, Dave, is what are your initial thoughts on the topic, and where do we? Are you seeing mind your head Braille sticker of the AI revolution, and how is that impacting the Braille users that you come across?
Thank you.
The Braille said you just bumped it rather than mind it.
Yeah, the Braille usually, I've got a lapel, I don't know if that's enough, let me know. Yeah, the Braille probably should say don't touch or something. Look, you know, the paved to hell, was it the road to hell is paved with other people's good intentions or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, obviously put Braille signage at hand level, right? Not eye level, because it's more discoverable at hand level if you put your Braille signage near light switches or door handles. I went on, I think it was Royal Caribbean, one of their cruises a few years ago, and they had thoughtfully put the Braille on the handrails, on the banisters, so you know you get to the bottom of the stairs or whatever, and it said where you were. So obviously, look, I think all of us are going to probably agree that we need to proceed with caution. We need to think carefully about assumptions that are made by technology designers. And I guess that my message will be, you know, design with us, not for us. You know, that will pretty much sum it up. And also, you know, the big assumption I think also that I'm here to kind of challenge is this idea that, you know, when it comes to blind people, that audio on its own is enough, because it isn't. And audio actually, for me, can be quite a passive experience. You know, I love audiobooks mainly because they help me fall asleep, you know, and it'll carry on playing whether I'm listening or not. So when I was a spotty youth and I was going to university, I had been taught Braille. And I naively had this kind of expectation that when I got to university, I would still be able to get information in Braille. And I hadn't realised that if I want that, I need to ask in advance, not like half a day in advance, but a week in advance, or maybe even a semester in advance. And it just didn't occur to me that would be the case. And I was reminded of, I think it was Douglas Adams who said about plans for the bypass being on display in the bottom of the locked filing cabinet in a disused lavatory, because I think that was where we found the Braille embosser at that university, you know, and of course nobody knew how to use it. So I definitely stopped using Braille because I just didn't think it was relevant. You know, I just felt like this was a format that was difficult for other people to produce. It was going to other me in ways that I wasn't kind of ready to accept. A bit like my cane, you know, I put it down for quite a while, and I pretended to myself and to other people that I didn't need it. And it was actually much later when I got into the world of work and really when I became a dad. And when I became a dad, I had a lot of anxiety about how was I going to teach my sighted son to read. It's not his fault he's sighted, by the way. We don't hold that against him. But how on earth were we going to teach him to read? Well, school will teach him the kind of the nuts and bolts. What we had to teach was kind of enthusiasm for books and to create that desire. And I realised that actually pretty early on that Braille was going to be the best way for me as his dad to read the bedtime story. I could put Stephen Fry on and leave the room, but you know he's not the father of my child, at least I don't think he is. And so. So I want to be reading that story, and I'm sure psychologists would make much out of the fact that I've got a recording somewhere of me reading a bedtime story to my son, where he asks me, "Dad, what is a shadow?" And the blind parent then explains to the sighted child what a shadow is. It's the region that is not reached by the light. It's sort of on the opposite side of an object from the light source. I didn't use those words with a 2-year-old, obviously, but I was able to kind of explain that, and it is that access to knowledge and to information that while we think here about academic potential, and I've brought with me this piece of amazing technology that's made in Seoul in South Korea that is basically like a screen for your fingers, like your monitor is for for your eyes. That technology didn't really exist back then, but what did exist was this need for me to do the same thing that I might borrow the microphone because this one's cutting out, isn't it? Shall I do that? Yeah. What did exist was the need for me as a parent to be able to build that relationship and to teach my son that reading Braille is a perfectly normal and valid way of reading. And the reason we use these combinations of little dots, right? People sometimes wonder, well, why don't blind people just use like tactile print? Like surely that would just be like easier for everybody. Well, it wouldn't, because if you imagine, say, a capital B, and reduce that to the size that's going to fit under your finger, that feels a lot like a number 8. It's that car number plate problem. So there are certain characters that you would find difficult to differentiate. And in the 1800s, there were many tactile reading systems developed, often by philanthropists and people who wanted to assure their place in heaven because they'd done a good thing for blind people. But actually, the tactile reading system, the one that prevailed, was Braille. And the reason is because Braille was developed by a blind person, a young blind person, who understood very deeply what other blind people needed, and that actually patterns of dots were going to be easier to distinguish than tactile versions of letters. It also needed to be a system that we could write ourselves with a simple frame and stylus. And he took inspiration from Charles Barbier, who developed a system called sonography, which was actually a 12-dot system. And what young Louis Braille realized was that the characters, if we were ever going to develop any reading fluency and get any kind of speed going, these characters needed to fit neatly under a human fingerprint. And so he reduced the number of dots to 6, and they fit beautifully under a human fingerprint. He also came up with a system that meant, so with Barbier's system, the patterns of dots represented sounds, like phonetic sounds. And what Braille kind of came up with was the idea that we needed a very literal system that represented all the letters of the alphabet, all the numbers, punctuation, other special systems, but also that would be scalable so that when we got to the future, we could add more symbols. So now we have hash signs and @ signs and all the symbols that you need in the modern world, because Braille has that extensibility to kind of grow. So Braille is used in over 100 languages, around the world. There are new ones being all the time. I've just recently started a conversation to develop a Braille code for the Manx language. There are new codes emerging in South Africa where they have 11 official languages. So Braille has that's the genius of Braille, is it has this ability to evolve. So if you want to know how something is spelled, you can arrow through with your screen reader and have the synthetic voice speak that out character by character. That's quite tedious, by the way, especially when it comes to things like coding. Yeah, and then we know that with some programming languages, indentation is quite important. Well, historically, when it came to Braille technology, we only had single line displays, because Braille displays were only made from a very specific kind of piezo electric crystal, which would actuate a lever. So they could only make single Braille line technology. And what's happened in recent years is we've had this explosion of Braille technology that's meant now we can have multiple lines of Braille on the same device, tactile graphics. We can show, a bell curve or a table or a scattergraph or something that previously just wouldn't have been possible in the digital domain. So going back to that mind your head sign, that is obviously somebody well-intentioned. They've put their sign up thinking, yeah, we've done a good thing there, but they haven't asked a single blind person, is this in any way useful, right? And we all know that retrofitting accessibility is more time-consuming, it's more expensive. And so we need to get in at the ground level while these systems are being built. And to some extent that is happening. I know that myself from the Brailleys Foundation and in my role at DOT, who is the technology that make the dot pad there, and also organisations like the National Federation of the Blind in the United States, we are actively involved in conversations with Microsoft and Google and others to ensure that these AI systems, that we can, one, harness them to do the things that we need them to do. So lots of blind people now using AI to get descriptions of images, very lucid and detailed descriptions, although, you know, every landscape is lush and, you know. My son's finished high school last year, and because he was the COVID generation, so he didn't get to have a kind of a leaving party for primary school. When he finished high school, it was very important to him that he had a big send-off, you know, and he talked to me about, you know, do you think we could get somebody to drive me there in like a fancy car, you know. Initially it was a Tesla, and then some things happened politically that changed his view on that. So it ended up being a Porsche, and so got this wonderful photograph of him sitting in the front of the Porsche with my friend who was driving, and I took the photograph thanks to, you know, the technology in my phone that can help, you know, tell me when two faces are in the view finder, and that's built into, you know, most smartphones now. And then I chucked it at, you know, a couple of AI models to get, you know, the description that I wanted, you know, and it told me quite confidently, and this is the thing about AI, it's confidently wrong so often, right? It told me about how, you know, this is a picture of a young man dressed smartly driving a whatever model sports car it was, and I can assure you definitely wasn't driving, right? He was 16 at the time, but obviously because it was trained on data from other parts of the world where you do drive on the other side of the vehicle, it obviously misinterpreted that. And so, you know, I was aware of that, but, you know, I think it's a very small example of where these things could go wrong. And I said there were two reasons why we as disabled people need to be involved. And of course, it's to make sure that it's doing the things that we want, but also challenging some of the preconceptions. And one of the areas that I'm actively involved in is how can we use AI to speed up workflows for producing tactile images, right? Because if you remember my university and the embosser, and they didn't know where it was or how to use it and things like that. And unfortunately, I still hear some of those stories today, right? And we need more expertise and more investment in that, but we also need technology that simplifies and speeds up some of those workflows. So if I realize, I've got chemistry this afternoon and I need a tactile of something, can I get that in 20 minutes, you know, without too much pain? And so we need to teach AI that visual intelligence isn't tactile intelligence, because they're very different domains.
I wanted to pick up on something you raised there, and it's about the fact that these technologies that succeeded were designed with people with disabilities involved in the creation of them. And it reminded me of a paper, I've just pulled it up on my laptop in front of me, from 2023 that I read in preparation for this, called Automated Ableism from Pennsylvania State University. What they did in this paper is they measured the sentiment or mood of certain sentences when they were looking at the most popular AI models at the time. And as an example, if you said to the AI model that your neighbor was tall, it gave a neutral sentiment to it. If you said your neighbor was beautiful, it gave it a score of 0.85, a very positive score. I think it goes from 1 to -1. If you said that your neighbor was blind, it gave it a -0.5. Or if you said that they had I think the phrase they used was a mentally handicapped person, it also gave it a negative score. So whatever is happening in the creation of these data sets is baking it in. When you couple this with some safeguards that are put into these AI models to protect organizations from PR nightmare like that happened on X, you get these AI models that are created in such a way to make a positive response at all times. So you don't find out the information you need if the AI thinks it's negative. And this has only come from the fact that the data scientists that are involved in making the models have not thought too much about the end result and what the impact that can have. I want to come back to Charlie. So Charlie, we have an accessibility champions network in IT services and the DGU, and there are a couple of others around the university. But they have historically always consisted of developers, designers, content authors, procurement professionals, HR professionals. I've never seen a accessibility champions network of data scientists or AI professionals. I guess my question to you is, how do you move a network into a new audience, such as data science, that haven't historically had a setup like this, and there isn't the resource available to set one up?
I think, like you've said, we know now that there are accessibility champions networks with HR, with legal, with developers, with designers. That wasn't always the case. There was people that were accessibility professionals and they were keen on it, and that's probably where it ended. And then you had to move into the design space and say, this is what's happening, this is the impact it's having, the design on the people that are using your service. And then we started with developers, which was tough, right? Like trying to get developers to be interested in accessibility seemed really difficult for a long time until you eventually realize you can speak their language. There'll be somebody that is interested in it. They will also pass that on as an accessibility champion and make sure that they're pushing in the right way and they're speaking to people that, from a culture change point of view, that are in their team, they're trusted. You're building it in from the beginning. It becomes the way that you do something. And then you started moving into legal and HR. It's the exact same way for data scientists in AI. This is just a new space. And so you start from the beginning. You start to explain and make sure that the language is right. And then you start to have that conversation about what it means and the impact that it has. You might talk about bias. You might talk about all these different things that are relevant to data scientists. And then you talk about the impact and you speak again, get disabled people in and explain that there needs to be a change and this is what's happening. And then you put governance around it like you would when it was talking about a design system or anything else like that. So it's just the same way of doing it. And champions networks are there because you don't want to talk about this in isolation. There's a way of doing something, and then there's a new way of doing something, and then there's new technology, and there's new thinking about it, and it becomes exciting. It becomes a space of innovation, rather than something where you're thinking there's a problem here, and we need to start figuring that out. It becomes, how can we make this better? How can we make sure that people are included? How can we make sure that we're the leaders in the industry, and now we get to talk about it, and there's a win here. And so for me personally, that's how the network grows. And there's going to be some data scientists that will be interested in this somewhere, And I think that's the important part, that you have to start from somewhere.
Thank you. So on the flip side, we've had accessibility champions networks in developers and designers for a long time. We've had the web content accessibility guidelines for a long time. And in the latest WebAIM survey, where they did an automated scan of the top 1 million web pages, there was 57 million automated accessibility defects that it found, which obviously results in an inaccessible web for people with disabilities. I think that's where AI-powered assistive technology can come in. Do you have any thoughts, Hector?
Yeah. So what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the deaf experience with the captions again. So when we first started doing captioning, there was like this militant group within the deaf community. It was like, don't you ever give us automated captions. We've got our human captioner, and we demand that level of quality in everything that we do. But as the technology got better and better and better, an inherent flexibility came up, for that group. So my boss is deaf. When I started working with her, I had to book every meeting a week in advance and kind of really make sure it was in the diary and send her notes ahead. By the end, she was taking up calls in her car, chatting to me while she was driving, right? Because she got so confident in the captions. And I want to just give you this example. I do think when I look at things like document accessibility, a Word document that's inaccessible, you can throw a camera at more easily, right, Dave? Right, than you can a web page that's got lots of design. challenges in it. You'll get different results from something that's fairly standard and boring. And so I have spoken to many blind people about how I just stopped asking my colleagues to make stuff accessible for me anymore, because I can wing it pretty well most of the time. I got bored of asking. Yeah, I feel like we're going to start to see a little bit of that in the web space, is that people are going to use these AI tools to start making stuff accessible, and it's only going to be when disabled people become good complainers that things will get fixed. And my one criticism, I mean, you mentioned the AFB earlier, and I'm saying this on camera, wow, they're pretty good complainers, right? You know, as in American blind people organisation, they're pretty, you know, they've got good legal teeth occasionally, right? What I think we're going to start to see, or I hope we're going to start to see, is, you know, we haven't seen the needle move in terms of websites being more accessible, and that's because we haven't really put the regulatory picture in place, and it's been a cost for people to do it too late in the process. Yeah. What I think we're going to start to see is this idea that coding's never finished now. You know, the product's never finished, and you're going to be able to turn to AI to kind of get you out of jail for at least 60-70% of the challenges, and then it becomes a honing problem, like a perfection problem, rather than just a you know, is it accessible or not problem. Does that feel right? Yeah. But I do think there's going to be this kind of melting pot of discussion between disabled people and what they expect in terms of accessibility, but also the skilling of, I think we're going to have to get to a point where companies can turn around to people and go, are you doing this right with your assistive technology? Could you be doing this? So that we can all kind of make progress together as a team, as opposed to just this, is it accessible or not? So I think like there's multiple responsibilities. There was one other thing, can I just say on the data analyst thing, or the data professional thing, you've got to make people understand their impacts. Yeah, as in if you look at HR, when I talk to procurement professionals and I say, when you buy inaccessible products, that means people lose their jobs. Well, nobody wants people to lose their jobs because you bought a product that no one can use in the organisation, right? That makes a lot of sense. I think when we come to kind of like the computer scientists, data analysts, data scientists, they have to understand their impact when they get it wrong. And I think that's the way to do it. And then there's just one other thing I would just quickly say, is that disability is a massive topic, and it has changed so much in my 30 years. Like when I started in assistive technology, it was mobility, vision, hearing, and speech. That was it. Yeah. Now it's neurodiversity and mental health, and neurodiversity is everywhere now, right? Good, right? You know, it's like it's not a problem. It's like let's have that conversation about it. But I do think when you go and speak to audiences that are not your natural hunting ground for things like making something visually accessible for somebody, talk about disability in the way that they can relate to, yeah, as opposed to just you know, I think we've got that opportunity that we didn't have years ago.
I was going to say, just before you move, you basically talk about education, right? And so like with some of the stuff, we're talking about, even with Champions Networks, we're talking about the best way of making accessible code. And they'll talk about the way that we can even do user research. And then we'll talk about the best way of even using your assistive technology. It's going to be an assistive technology to a point, you know? And so then you're talking about what's the right prompt? You know, what language do you need to be careful of? Like what can you then look at, and how can you analyse what the work that it is that you've done? Just to give you an example, Jamie Knight, who's fabulous in the accessibility community, has asked an AI to look at how WCAG, or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, contradicts itself, and has started, and has started to be like, right, okay, let's have a little look at that, and let's then have that discussion, you know, and so we can go back and say, is it what we've done is right, you know, and we can kind of analyse ourselves, and I think that's the way that we improve and admit that sometimes we're not going to get it right, you know, the way that we've done things historically, wonderful, but can we do it better? And you can use this and reduce some of the maybe cognitive load or the admin that comes from that, and then start to make leaps and bigger progression, because that bit's done, and let's have a little look and see how we can make this better for everybody.
Thank you. Just one final point before we move into Q&A. I'm going to pass back to you, Dave. You mentioned the difference between the passive reading experience of an audiobook versus the active comprehension exercise of reading in Braille, and I thought that was very interesting, especially when I consider the tool that you've brought in on the desk in front of you. I wanted to ask, as a final point before Q&A, what advances in AI have you either seen recently or are you hopeful of that would accelerate the reading and writing, the study skills that for people that read Braille?
Well, generally, I think we have heard about improvements in AI because of the work I mentioned earlier with the organisations trying to, sort of talk with big tech and sort of say, actually, if I tell you I'm blind, don't give me a score of minus whatever it was, 0.5. And it's been a while since AI has offered sympathy when I tell it I'm blind, which is progress, right? And small progress. But when it comes to Braille, actually, at the moment, AI still has a fairly poor grasp of Braille. It might give you the rudiments, but again, it'll confidently assert things that are not quite right. And what we're sort of trying to do at DOT is to work with Google and Microsoft on this idea that AI might help with speeding up the workflow. And when you were talking about how accessibility and disability is sort of evolved, this word accessibility gets sort of thrown around almost sort of with abandon, as if it's just like everyone's got the same understanding of what it actually means, which I'm not sure is always the case. I hope we can all agree that it's not a checklist, right? And that the AI, if it does these 6 things, then it'll be doing accessibility well, because accessibility isn't necessarily about a checklist, although, there are tools that will test against a list. If I go to my presentation or lecture or whatever it is, and somebody puts up an infographic on a display at the front of the room, and then I don't know, maybe a piece of technology describes that to me in a few sort of pithy sentences. Is that accessibility? I want to be able to feel the river and how it meanders through the city, or feel the shape of a double helix, or any of the things that somebody would see. You talk about the solar system. Try and describe the planets for me. Well, you might get a colour if you look at. Somebody might say, "Oh, well, this one's blue and this one's right." Any more on that? So a bit more detail. So I think AI is making progress. But I think with Braille, we still need transcribers. We need tactile graphic artists to oversee and work with people like myself and big tech to make sure that for tactile readers and users that the AI is helping and not hindering that kind of access.
Thank you very much.